Let's now look at the final recommendation for your MCR core task. This is for July 2017. Now, if you recall, this assignment is about your character of the organization, the culture, and the identity, and how it is at the moment impacting the reputation of the organization. So in task 1.1, we've discussed the concepts surrounding it. In task 1.2, we've done a detailed audit and understood the strengths and weaknesses related to the areas we just discussed. And with those findings, we are now ready for a recommendation. Now remember, when you go in front of a board to make a recommendation at a strategic level, you got to be decisive. You got to have evidence to justify your issues, plus you should have enough support to substantiate your recommendations. The board will also look at any options that you are suggesting critically. They're going to challenge you to see the robustness of your recommendations. So you got to have some benchmarks of others trying to do similar recommendations, any learnings out of those, and how do you plan to overcome some of the mistakes that others have made trying to do exactly what you were trying to do. So ladies and gentlemen, you got to get this right. Your neck on line, and it's your recommendations. So how do you start this? The platform for starting your recommendations is to appreciate some of the key highlighted issues that you found in task 1.2. So that's a good start. And then you could also spend a little bit of time appreciating the framework that you plan to use with regard to the identity strategy that you're recommending. So it could be a model, it could be a framework, which includes some of the key decisions, key areas of focus with regard to identity strategy. At the heart of it, you would look at areas like symbolism, communications, and the behaviors. You would look at some of the gaps that you found between, example, the communicated identity and the conceived identity. So you got to put a framework in. If I were you, I'll draw a diagram so which shows some of the critical areas of focus. Now in any strategy, you would have to take some decisions in its execution, which generally includes areas with regard to structural changes, some cultural changes, even some policy changes, and of course coming into some practical or practice of what you do in the organization. So set that framework that you're going to use with regard to an identity strategy. Now the examiner uses the word coherent. That means when you do something with regard to, let's say, the symbolism of the company, it has to also be coherent with the communications. These have to sync. If they are going in two different directions, you're not going to have a coherent strategy. So look at the interrelationship of what you're recommending. One recommendation versus the other. You could address these issues at each sub-recommendation, or at the end put it all together, identifying the linkages and areas there could be contradicting situations. So keep that in mind. So with that said, you could now start addressing specific areas. For example, let's say you diagnose in 1.2 issue with regard to symbolism. A company with multi-SBUs might be using symbolisms that are not consistent with the corporate brand. There could be issues of, example, your old head office building and the outlook, example in the case of Cargill's, the Cargill's Miller's building, might not be in line with the new age Cargill's buildings that are coming out, which are fairly visible symbols in the eyes of your stakeholders, internal as well as external. Leaving aside the logos and some of the other aspects to your symbolism of the organization. So what are you going to do about it? What's your strategy to harmonize some of those symbolisms, issues that you have? So, and when you give this recommendation, you got to link it to the framework that you have already established at the start. And also when you make a recommendation, you got to look at the pros and the cons of those recommendations and justify why the pros or the positives will outweigh some of the challenges of executing these recommendations. And at the end of each one of these recommendations, you have to look at any financial implications or political implications. Now, for example, when you try to refurbish or restructure a physical environment of an organization with probably historical significance, in the case of, let's say, Cargill's original building in Fort, you got to take a conscious call on any political backlash, any political resistance, and you got to identify that. Financially, to resurrect a building like that and make it more modern, if that is the strategy to keep in line with your new identity, you got to understand some of the significant financial implications of doing that. So this is how you set up piece by piece your recommendations. On the other hand, you might even look at some structural changes to support your overall communication strategy, which is critical in MCR point of view. How do you structure your internal comms? What type of policies that you want to put in place? What type of practices? Now, this is a good place for you to go and benchmark how another company has taken such initiatives, so that you could look at what you plan to do in line with somebody who's done that before, take the learnings, and look at the ways of overcoming some of the issues they've had when they implemented similar strategies. So benchmarking using case studies is going to be a big element to give confidence to your board and your CEO that your recommendations are not totally out of the box, are never heard type of initiatives, but keeping into the originality of your recommendation, you're building on some of the work that has already been tried and tested, which is a good place to start what you plan to do. So we are looking at about 3 to 4 very robust recommendations. Don't be afraid to draw some diagrams in your process flows or structures that you plan to implement, because those will give a far better presentation. And remember to justify your recommendation and ensure that they don't go into a very tactical execution, into product related basic execution or some promotional aspects, but you can keep it at a high level. For an example, if you plan to launch a corporate communication campaign, which is going to be a critical initiative to drive your corporate comms, you could talk about the platforms which we discuss under storytelling, on which your corporate comms could be built on. But don't go into the ground level of figuring out what type of models you're going to use in it or what type of storyboard you're going to use in it, but stick to the overall platform that you're going to build it on. It could be rags to richer story, it could be a bouncing back from crisis story, it could be about commitment to quality story, but use your theory and set that overall big picture communication strategy rather than going into nitty-gritty. So this is a critical area to focus on. After establishing about 3 to 4 high-level recommendations, the examiner reminds you how to score higher marks and how some of these recommendations will impact the overall operation of the company. For an example, if you want to put some extra controls into your management comms. So for an example, when a CEO speaks at a forum, there is a set of standards that has to be followed, set of brand guidelines that have to be followed. Some of these speeches might need to be validated, vetted, and approved by the corporate comms team. Now this might change the way your company operates today. Where your CEO used to go and make off-the-cuff speeches has now suddenly changed. So you can indicate some of these operational changes that could have an overall impact of the organization. Just imagine if the corporate comms team of Donald Trump takes a decision to vet every single one of his tweets before it goes out. Now that's going to change the way the Trump presidency operates. And there could be significant political issues. In fact, some of the communication heads might lose their job trying to make such recommendation because it's not in line with the culture of the organization. So you got to understand some of the interlinked issues of the recommendations you are making. Watch for those implications, but remember, be decisive in the recommendations that you make. So in summary, set the framework on which you are going to build the identity strategy using a theory or a benchmark case study of a company who's done a similar initiative. Then go one by one and take at least 3 to 4 strong recommendations. Indicate the political and financial consequences of your recommendations. At the end, look at the big picture interrelationships of your recommendations, some of the complications it could bring in, and possible ways to overcome it or cushion them. And finally, show how your recommendations will help build a better reputation while strengthening what's already there, and also how your recommendations will help protect possible negative impacts of the reputation.